Coming up, languishing in the national polls, and yet again this week, losing 2 more by-elections in so-called safe seats, the increasingly desperate Conservatives have reverted to type, going into cheat mode even before the next election campaign has officially started. From gerrymandering to ID checks, from campaign cash limits to expat voting rights, the evidence of electoral manipulation by the Tories is overwhelming. Forget levelling up. The top Tory policy in 2024 is to create as unlevel a playing field as possible for the next general election. Stay tuned. The Boundary Commission for each of the home nations is given the task of redrawing constituency boundaries, and traditionally these changes are made to reflect demographic changes in the population. But in their 2023 review, the Commission in England proposed changes based on the number of registered voters rather than the raw population. This decision favours the Conservatives as their voter base skews older and has higher registration rates. The Electoral Reform Society estimates that this could hand the Tories an extra 10 to 15 seats, tipping the scales in their favour. And though the Boundary Commission claims neutrality as what they call an arm's-length public body, they're sponsored by Michael Gove's Department for Levelling Up, Housing and Communities, so the timing and rationale behind this change of policy stinks and has the fingerprints of the odious Gove all over it. And if you want to submit an official question about it, do bear in mind that Gove is also the gatekeeper when it comes to freedom of information requests and has spent the last few years making it ever harder to get transparency about the way that this government comports itself. The introduction of mandatory voter ID by this government is a huge bone of contention. I realise it might not seem that big an issue to truth to power viewers in other countries, but you have to understand that in the UK there is no standard ID card that the population is issued with by the government. If you don't have a passport or a driving licence or certain other forms of photo ID, you have to go through the rigmarole of applying for voter ID through a government website. This affects an estimated 2 million UK voters, and at the local elections last May, only 85,000 of them, that's just 4%, applied for the new voter ID. The government insists this legislation was needed to combat voter fraud, but data suggests that voter fraud is practically non-existent in the UK. Rarer, in fact, than the number of Tory MPs from this government forced from office after committing sexual offences. But it gets even worse. This Tory trick disproportionately affects younger voters and minority groups who are less likely to hold the required photo ID, effectively suppressing their vote USA style. It's incredible as well that student cards are excluded from the list of acceptable photo ID, whilst senior rel cards are acceptable. As students overwhelmingly vote against the Tories and the elderly are rather more inclined to vote for the Tories, this is outrageous and blatant anti-democratic cheating by the party in power. Added to that, the Tories are also making postal votes harder to obtain and return, which disproportionately impacts those with disabilities or long-term illness, and again, just happen to be groups of voters that skew against the Tories. Before I go any further, can I please ask you to hit the like button, unless you don't like the video of course, in which case please remember to hit the dislike button twice. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, and share a link on your social media. Thanks. The government has decided to grant voting rights to long-term expats, known in their chosen country of exile, of course, as British immigrants. This includes those who've been residing outside the UK for decades and don't pay their tax in the UK. I mean, it may seem like a noble gesture on the surface, but I'm very concerned about how someone with a distant connection to the UK, whose loyalties now lie with a different country, may not be voting in the best interests of Britain. Also, on the one hand, we get draconian laws clamping down on the very rare voter fraud within the UK, but because the Tories' inquiries lead them to believe that long-term expats skew towards voting Conservative, then suddenly they couldn't give a toss about voter fraud. It stinks of hypocrisy, or worse. The relaxed eligibility and ID requirements for exiles compared to voters actually in the UK just shows the immoral lengths that the Tories are prepared to go to gain an unfair electoral advantage. The decision to increase spending caps for political campaigns has been spun as a means of levelling the playing field with well-funded independent candidates, but it primarily benefits the Conservative Party, which receives huge donations from massive corporations that dwarf the funds available to their political rivals. The recent doubling of the spending cap for election campaigns will boost the Conservatives' already significant financial resources, allowing them to vastly outspend Labour on their campaign leading up to the next election. Like their voter suppression tactics and their gerrymandering, this further tactic of removing spending caps shows that the Tories are taking the UK's democracy a step closer to the American model, where money is king. Yes, we've all been gaslit for years about how the BBC is said to have a left-wing bias, but it's just not true. Usually, the Tories kicking the BBC for lefty bias quote comedy programmes which are having a go at the current government, following in the centuries-old tradition of political satire and lampooning those in power. Satire doesn't really work if it's directed against opposition parties who are not in power. That's self-evident, but never let the facts get in the way of a war of intimidation being waged by this government against the BBC. And comedy aside, until recently we had years of most BBC political output being presented by the very good at his job but also very right-wing Andrew Neil. We now have the incompetent and more obviously biased Laura Kuenssberg presenting the flagship weekend BBC politics show Sunday with Laura Kuenssberg. Anyone who's watched this will have noted the difference in attitude between when she's interviewing Tory and opposition politicians. She's not known as Tory Laura for nothing. Here she is thanking Shadow Home Secretary Labour's Yvette Cooper, who was a guest on the show recently.
To get rid of the Conservatives, where everything feels broken right across the country. We've had low growth, low opportunities. It's time for something better. People deserve a fairer deal.
There are plenty of people who come to the studio who would disagree with you. Many people watching might disagree with you too. But Yvette Cooper, you've set out Labour's position this morning. Thank you very much indeed for being with us now.
And here she is thanking Tory Business and Trade Minister Kemi Badenoch.
And making sure that Rishi Sunak has all the support that he needs to be able to deliver his 5 priorities in this government.
Kemi Badenoch, thank you so much for joining us all the way from New Zealand. It's great to have you on the programme for the first time. Hope we see you back here soon. Thank you. Now, also...
Quite a difference, isn't there? In fact, Laura Kuenssberg has a whole history of anti-Labour Party bias, probably the most egregious of which was the day before the last general election, claiming on air that submitted postal votes were looking pretty grim for Labour in a lot of parts of the country. Now, viewing postal votes prior to polling day is in breach of guidelines set by the Electoral Commission, and predicting electoral outcomes based on votes cast prior to polls closing is a criminal offence. And that's just one of several examples of her pro-Tory credentials. Left-wing bias at the BBC, with her as the face of the flagship politics show. You're having a laugh. And don't even get me started with Fiona Bruce on Question Time. With her in the chair, I find the pro-government bias renders the programme unwatchable. Now, you might think this is all just a matter of perception, but when you remember that the BBC Board of Governors has been infiltrated by political appointments made by the Conservative Party, it makes the idea of BBC left-wing bias completely ludicrous. Director General Tim Davie does a great job, but he previously stood as a Tory councillor in West London. One of the Brexit cult leaders, Robbie Gibb, who was Tory Prime Minister Theresa May's head of communications, is now a non-exec director on the BBC board. In a recent meeting, he directly addressed Newsnight staff in an apparent attempt to teach them how to be more impartial. Worried journalists working on the programme were gobsmacked by Gibbs' perception of his role. As a non-executive board member, he doesn't formally have any authority over programmes, yet there he is, interfering on behalf of the government. Ex-Newsnight journalist Emily Maitlis describes Gibb as an active agent of the Conservative Party working within the BBC to influence its political stance to being more pro-government. As well as 90% of newspaper sales in the UK being for right-wing Tory backing titles, we also have the new dark-funded right-wing TV channels such as Talk TV and GB News. These channels are making massive, heavy financial losses, and even their more popular programmes get less views than a Truth to Power video. But for some reason, the secret funding from their secret backers keeps on coming. This week, Sunak appeared for an hour taking bonkers questions from a bonkers GB News audience in a clear infraction of impartiality rules that the toothless Ofcom is failing to enforce. Yet more cheating in an election year. And of course, all these dirty tricks are taking place within the context of a voting system which is in itself rigged. The literally medieval first-past-the-post system has an inbuilt bias favouring the SNP, Labour, but most particularly the Tories, who last time round won 43.6% of the popular vote, but got 56% of seats in Parliament, giving them a massive majority in Westminster, despite winning less than half of the popular vote. Look at this graph from the Electoral Reform Society, showing the number of votes needed to win one MP in Parliament. On average, it took only about 38,000 votes to elect a Conservative MP, while it took a massive 51,000 votes for one Labour MP. Even more strikingly, it took about 866,000 votes to elect the one Green Party MP. Every other European country, bar Belarus, uses proportional representation as a much more democratic electoral system. Australia and New Zealand have also both dumped the old inherited British FTPT system in favour of a more modern and democratic PR system. All this evidence shows a political landscape where the pursuit of power by the Tory party overshadows the principles of a level playing field and equal access to the ballot box. The Conservatives are learning from Donald Trump's Conservative Republican Party in the USA to ensure the dominance of money, gerrymandering and voter suppression in elections. In this UK general election year, independent media and institutions, and also, of course, people like you and me, we must shine a light on these Conservative tricks and ensure as fair a contest as possible within the constraints of our undemocratic FPTP electoral system.